Rob, moving on to Saturday, starting with that sort of hallowed South Island derby that the Kiwis like to talk about. Highlanders, Crusaders. We haven't seen the Highlanders yet this year. Then Reds, Force, Stormers, Blues, and finally the Sharks against the Lions, which you did touch on earlier.
Yes. Highlanders, of course, not having seen them yet, you can't be quite sure what to expect. They were quite a fancy of mine the last couple of seasons. I've sort of looked at them on paper and thought, surely this is a team that should be doing better. So I think there's a little bit of pressure on them to deliver. They've had the opportunity to look at all the other sides during their sort of gap week, which is, of course, not necessarily the most productive of things to have as a team. You don't usually want your bye in the first round, but they did get the opportunity to sit back and do some prep on some of their opponents. And they will have realised, I think, that the Crusaders very, very sort of under-delivered in their first game. I mean, a horrendous defeat really for them to the Rebels. So Crusaders under pressure to bounce back. I guess I just about tipped them to do it. That Reds Force Australian derby, Reds were so shocking in going down.
What has happened to that team?
Yeah, 47-3. But again, on paper, you think Reds team should be capable in Brisbane of sort of bouncing back. So I think I've gone for them a little bit, sort of narrowly against the Force.
Something that I find interesting about the Force and the Rebels is that they're essentially invitational sides. I mean, rugby union is not an indigenous sport in those areas.
Yes, that's right.
And they, in a short space of time, have become really formidable teams.
Yeah, they're almost sort of like Cavaliers 15s, aren't they? That sort of thing, and that can actually make them very unpredictable at times. The Rebels, I suppose, can look ghastly one week, and then all of a sudden, we've noticed in previous seasons that all of a sudden they put it together and they knock over a sort of a big cheese along the way.
Yeah.
Although they generally still recede to the sort of bottom end of the table, I still think that they and the Force are not necessarily going to last the pace. I think you're going to find that if a couple of sort of critical players get injured along the way, they're not going to have the squad depth that some of the more established franchises, as you were saying, have. So, they're not really my fancy. But then I suppose turning to South Africa, the big game, the headline game, of course, really will be the Sharks-Lions match. And it's a game that I really think is a must-win for the Sharks, because if they were to go 0 from 2 home games against Cheetahs and Lions respectively, it would be a near disaster for them, and very tough for them to actually claw their way back to become certainly serious contenders for the title. I still think that there's scope for them to come back and perhaps boss the conference, especially once they get back some of these Japan-based players, which they don't yet have in their ranks. So a few worrying signs for them, and I think Johan Ackermann will have drummed into his Lions guys that they had a great opportunity to beat the Hurricanes last week. Did enough in so many areas to do it, but they didn't. So I think they'll be pretty fired up, and I think they might enjoy the fact that it looks as though it might be a bit soggy in Durban, and will want to sort of come back pretty strongly. So tight game to call. I think I went by sort of 1 point for the Sharks. I really believe it could be that close, and with home advantage, maybe just getting them over the line. But I see the Stormers at Newlands perhaps being a little bit more clear-cut against the Blues. I think they've got a great momentum to bring home from that Loftus win, and with I would imagine a pretty good crowd expected in at Newlands. That should help to sort of power them along to a good win against the Blues. But you can never say with any confidence that any South African team will beat any New Zealand team on any given day. But I've got them on paper doing it by perhaps about 6 or 7 points.
Rob, on that note, I was at the Stormers press conference earlier this morning and spoke to Dwayne Vermeulen about exactly that, sort of the mind shift from playing a huge local opponent like the Bulls to then playing a New Zealand opponent. Let's have a look at what he said.
Yeah, as South African guys, it's always about brute strength and grunt, and you really want to challenge that guy, because you all of us are playing for a Bok position. So that's the one thing. But playing against New Zealand or Australian guys is a hell of a different challenge. They play with a lot more flair. They really give the ball a lot more air, and so it's a different challenge. But things that we really focus on and that we have to work on.
Karen, you agree with that? New Zealand, Australian sides are not necessarily any less physical than playing against the Bulls, but possibly a bit more flair.
Absolutely. As Dwayne mentioned there, playing against a fellow South African player when you're playing for a position in the Springbok squad certainly brings out something in you. It's one thing, these derby matches, the players know each other so well, but they also know at the back of their minds, Springbok coach Hanneke May is probably watching, seeing who matches up best, who forms the best loose trio. So that's the added incentive of playing against a local derby. When you play against these overseas players, you don't see as often. It's not like you play them in Currie Cup, Vodacom Cup, Super Rugby. When you see them perhaps once a year, once every 2 years in some cases, you never really know what to expect. They do play with a lot more flair. As you said, they probably are as physical, but they tend to pass the ball. They like to get the ball running, give the ball some air, especially the New Zealand team. So it's going to be a completely different challenge for Dwayne Vermeulen this weekend, up against perhaps Jerome Kino as opposed to Pierre Spies last weekend. So
his 100th cap too.
Yeah, and he's playing his 100th game, which I think will see that the Stormers team getting behind their inspirational skipper and leading them to victory at Newlands on Saturday. That this is the one game that I think on paper, perhaps even the bookies saying it's the widest margin, perhaps, even though this Blues team last weekend ran the Chiefs pretty close. They've had to fly all the way from Auckland to Cape Town, long flight. Can't really expect them to be over the jet lag yet. So, I expect them to perhaps be, up for it in the first half, but then the second half, the Stormers team to perhaps run away with it a little bit. Stormers, have been tough to beat at Newlands for a couple of years now. Hopefully a crowd turns up, gets behind them, which will, make a big difference. But I've got the Stormers to win by perhaps 9 or 10 points.